In the summer of 1981, a recording studio in London was the site of a quiet murder. There was no weapon, no motive, and no victim in the traditional sense, but the career was ending. Inside the booth sat one of the most expected session drummers in the UK. He had played on platinum records and possessed a swing that simply couldn't be taught. But on the other side of the glass, the producer wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the box.
Over to studios or to musicians' homes in LA, where I lived at the time, and all I had to do was just pop it out of the case and plug it in, and just press the button, and they'd hear a recording of a snare drum come out, and they were just floored.
When I created both of these features in 1979, it was my intent that they should aid the musician's skills, not replace them. It was a clunky, wood-paneled machine with a series of plastic buttons and a small flickering display. It didn't have a soul, and it didn't have a heartbeat, but it had something the drummer didn't. It was perfectly mathematically correct. When the producer pressed start, the machine emitted a kick drum so heavy, so clinical, and so consistent that the room seemed to vibrate differently. The drummer looked at his sticks, then at his kit, and realized he was looking at a museum piece. This is the story of the $100 million revolution. It's the story of how a single piece of technology, the drum machine, didn't just change the sound of the 80s. It effectively fired the heartbeat of rock and roll. It was a digital weapon that forced every major band on the planet to ask a terrifying question. Is a human being actually a liability? To understand why this happened, we have to look at the Lin LM1. Before 1980, drum machines were essentially toys.
There were drum machines at the time, but they were all preset drum machines, and they all didn't sound very good. They sort of sound like crickets on a bad day. And so
They were the cheesy bossa nova presets you'd find on a home organ that sounded like rhythmic static. But Roger Lynn, a guitarist with a frustration for keeping time, changed everything. He didn't want a machine that imitated a drum. He wanted a machine that was a drum.
that in '86 that I was contacted by the Akai company, which at the time had been a consumer electronics company, but they had spun off this other division to make high-end musical instruments.
The LM1 was the first to use real digital samples of acoustic drums. When you pressed the button, you weren't hearing a synth circuit. You were hearing a recording of a real snare hitting a real room. But there was the catch. Once that sound was inside the machine, it was stripped of its humanity. In music theory, we talk about the grid. A human drummer naturally pushes and pulls. They play a millisecond ahead of the beat to create excitement, or a millisecond behind to create groove.
I created this operating system for recording drum beats where I created things like timing correction and swing that made it much more useful. And so
This is what we call swing. But the LM1 offered quantization. It took your imperfect human input and snapped it to a perfect mathematical grid. Suddenly, the errors that made rock and roll feel alive were being scrubbed away.
Leon Russell, the guy was a songwriter and pianist, and he actually used drum machines in his recording process as a way to keep the time steady. That way, if the drummer didn't sound good, he could always erase the drummer and put a new drummer on the same track. And
For the record labels, this was a dream. A machine doesn't get tired. A machine doesn't demand royalties. A machine doesn't show up late to the studio because it's having an ego crisis. It was the ultimate corporate instrument. No band illustrates this tension better than Genesis. In 1970s, Genesis was a fortress of progressive rock, led by complex polyrhythmic drumming of Phil Collins. But as the 80s dawned, the band underwent a radical transformation. If you listen to the 1983 track Mama, the song begins not with a drum fill, but with a harsh industrial loop from a limb drum. It's cold and menacing. Phil Collins, arguably one of the greatest drummers in history, was now playing to the machine. The machine was the leader. He was the accompaniment. This created a ripple effect across the industry. In Texas, ZZ Top, the kings of blues rock boogie, did the unthinkable. We started playing to click tracks, drum machines and sequencers for added precision, and found that we enjoyed it. For their album Eliminated, they moved away from the loose, swampy feel of their 70s record and embraced sequencers and drum machines. The result was a $100 million success story. Songs like Sharp Dressed Man and Legs were built on a rigid, unwavering 120 beats per minute clock. It was catchy, it was danceable, and it was perfect for the burgeoning MTV era. But behind the scenes, the tensions were palpable. The band was no longer three guys jamming in a room. There were three guys serving a digital metronome. As the drum machine became the standard, the working drummer became an endangered species. In the UK, the Musicians' Union actually attempted to ban drum machines from recording sessions and live performances. They saw the writing on the wall. If a machine could provide a perfect beat, why would the label pay for a session pro, a drum tech, a studio with a high ceiling, and 8 hours of mic placement? But the machine's victory wasn't just about money. It was about the 80s sound. I accidentally pressed the reverse talkback while he was playing, and the most almighty sound came out of the speaker. This was the era of the gated reverb, that massive exploding snare drum you hear on every hit from 1984.
Tape home for me. Peter said, no, I'd like, just play that for 10 minutes and I can use that. So that's how that intruder sound was kind of discovered, if you like.
That sound is almost impossible to achieve naturally with a human drummer in a standard room. It required the isolation and the consistency that only a triggered machine could provide.
Dum, 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 and then it shuts off. Dum, 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 and then there's...
The music was becoming architecture, built block by block on a computer screen, rather than flowing like a river. So did the machine win? Not entirely, because something fascinating happened. The very drummers who were supposedly being replaced, men like Phil Collins, Stuart Copeland, and Jeff Porcaro, did something brilliant. They didn't fight the machine. I like drum machines a lot. I think they are much maligned instruments. They mastered it. They realized that the machine's perfection was actually its weakness.
And stuff. So again, sort of trying to use equipment that was around them, but always finding ways of sort of abusing it in a way. And
it was boring, so they started misusing the technology. They programmed swing back into the chips. They layered live drums over the digital loops to create a hybrid sound that felt both futuristic and ancient. The $100 million drum machine didn't kill the drummer. What it actually did was kill the idea of the drummer as a mere timekeeper.
The drums, kind of, even if they'd have done the same thing with another drummer, not to say it would have sounded the same, because I was really, after playing the drums all my life, you get a personality with.
It forced musicians to realize that if all you're doing is keeping the beat, a $5,000 box can do your job better than you. I didn't sit down and think, what would be the best drum fill? I just did it. It could have been anything. To survive, you had to offer something a machine couldn't: personality, unpredictability, and soul. As time moves forward, we'll all realize that if something can be programmed, it's no longer art. Today, we live in a world of total quantization. Almost every pop song you hear is snapped to a perfect digital grid. The digital weapon of the 80s won the war.
I mean, you can put a Fender Strat in the hands of another guitar player, but it won't ever sound like Eric Clapton, because it's his personality.
But if you look at the most successful artists today, they are the ones who are desperately trying to find the human error again. We've spent 40 years trying to make machines sound like people, and people sound like machines. The next time you hear that iconic, booming 80s snare, remember it wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of a revolution. It was the sound of the heartbeat of rock and roll being moved from the chest of a human being into a silicon chip, and music has never been the same since. Keep listening. Thank you for your time and wish you all the best.